Hello everybody and welcome to the Aggieville Alleycats podcast. Where come rain, shine, or anything in between, we're here to deliver to you the Kansas State sporting news that you so love. I'm Ace Edwards and it's, again, just me for this episode. Connor is just getting back from Ireland, so it's just going to be me giving the preview for the game this coming Saturday up against the North Dakota Fighting Hawks. And top down, this is going to be probably a little bit of a shorter preview, just A, by virtue of it just being me, and B, a lot of the analytics and things that we use are considerably harder to get for an FCS school. We still did some film study, delve into a little bit of film, and of course we're going to go through their stats from the previous season, but let's just go ahead and dive straight in to the North Dakota Fighting Hawks, who last year were not the greatest in terms of true FCS teams. They did open the season up against Iowa State, which I know is a name everyone wants to hear right now. But they were able to rattle off a really impressive victory up against, I believe, number 5 at the time, Montana, even though they had a high passing yards of 97 in that game. But what they did towards the back end of the year was they just really collapsed under their own weight. They lost basically every game except for one up against Northern Iowa in the back end of the year. So it was a team that probably just kind of front-loaded themselves and just probably aren't necessarily the best in terms of FCS schools. They aren't the South Dakotas that we saw a few years ago in that famous game where Skyler got hurt for like the 17th time. But all in all, this is a gettable FCS team, but we can dive straight into the players and scheming here. In terms of scheming on offense, we always start on the offensive side of the ball. They're a multiple team, I think is the best way to describe it. They do have, at least if we're going off of last year, they did have a coaching change, so this all could be a complete change from who knows what's going to happen this year. But last year, they were very multiple in terms of what they did offensively. On a snap-to-snap basis, they would have this true spread 3-wide or 4-wide set where they're just going to try and utilize space as best they can, although they weren't really a screen team. And the very next play, they would go with this hyper-compact jumbo formation just to get those extra few yards. And that also sort of speaks to another few things about their offensive philosophy. The first of which is they weren't a terribly prolific passing team this previous year. I mean, their starting quarterback, who they did end up returning, that's Simon Romfro, who is 5'10", which is probably the most notable thing about him. This is the second time that we face an FCS quarterback below 6 foot, I believe, in the history of this show. He did throw for 2,000 yards, but it was just barely over 2,000 yards. 18 touchdowns to 8 interceptions, and 21 times he was sacked. So those aren't numbers that you're expecting from like a true air raid team or someone who's going to air out the ball a lot. It's much more they're using the passing game as a sort of complement to the running game, and that's the second big note is they do use a lot of the running back by committee approach. I mean, they had three running backs last year get 90 or more carries, and they returned 2 of those 3. So you're going to see a lot in the way of running back rotation, so that way they can keep guys fresh. And in the running game, they do run a lot of the zone counter game that we're more used to being in the Big 12, where you are going to see a lot of those spread running concepts, but they also kind of run them from those more compact formations as well. So you're going to see a lot of zone, which just means that you're going to have to stay very disciplined on that side of the ball on defense whenever you're playing up against the run. But they also, just a weird note, they really enjoy I always call it a boomerang motion, where they have a receiver motion to the backfield, run around the quarterback, and then basically go right back out to the flats. I think that's just them trying to force zone coverages because it's nearly impossible to play a true man coverage whenever you get that motion just because you have to communicate so well. And even then, it's going to take you a little bit to sort of get there. especially if they do a return motion where they're just going to go right back to where they were anyway. But it's an offense that very well could see a lot of changes, I mentioned before, with the coaching change, but it's not an offense that's terribly prolific. I mean, towards the back end of the year, they did have 2 games where they put up more than 30 points, but they also had a few games where the offense just wasn't very good. I mean, they were consistently putting up, about 20, and that's up against FCS defenses, including ones like Indiana State, Youngstown State. And the passing game especially follows that very feast or famine philosophy, because there are multiple games with just over or just under 100 passing yards, and it really came down to the running game to get the majority of the production for North Dakota. And speaking of, they do return 2 of their 3 leading rushers in Gavin Zybarth and Sawyer Seidel. Those are both really solid running backs. Sawyer is definitely the bigger play threat of the 2. A lot faster, averaged a few more yards per carry this last year. And Zybarth is, God help me for bringing up stereotypes, but he's the white running back that's going to get the more consistent dirty yards, averaged 4 yards per carry previous year, but did get 8 touchdowns. So running backs, neither of them are world beaters. I'd say that they're average to above average FCS running backs. And considering that K-State has seen some of the better FCS running backs in years past, they don't terrify me as much as other running backs in the past have. And this also kind of leads us to their quarterback, who I did mention is short, and honestly, that is the most notable thing about him. I mean, he's a generally solid decision maker with a decent enough mobility, but if it sounds like I'm kind of talking in circles about him, it's because he's not the most notable player. Honestly, he's an all-right FCS quarterback, and that's about it. And then you have the receiving core, who they did lose their top receiver in Isaiah Smith, or rather they lost their top receiver in Bo Belquist, and they returned Caden Dennis, who is their second leading receiver, but there's also a massive gap between Belquist and Dennis. Belquist had 65 catches, 930 yards, and Dennis had 32 catches for 245 yards. So a lot of their passing game, when it was there, was mostly run through Bo Belquist, and Caden Dennis was much more of a complementary piece. So I am very curious to hear or see how they are going to adjust to that. Who is going to be their top receiver? Because they do have guys that are above 6 foot. In fact, I think Caden Dennis is 6'2", but none of them have that elite deep threat speed that is going to really scare you, especially in an offense that is going to use the passing game more as a means to keep you honest defensively, as opposed to this true, this is not a passing team. This is a team that is capable of passing, but much rather would run the ball more than anything else. So really, that's it for the offensive side of the ball. And it's much shorter than usual, again, by virtue of it being just me, but because their offense isn't really the most notable one and the most notable part of the team. Though they did have a really good third down conversion rate the previous year of 45.6%. And that's just by virtue of they're very good at not getting themselves into bad positions, which again speaks to they're not good, they're not bad, they're just pretty solid in terms of their offensive production. But that leads us to the defensive side of the ball, which will probably have the most changes, because last year they ran a hybrid defense where they were running a lot of 5-man surfaces. That's 5 men on the line of scrimmage with 2 linebackers being walked up on the edges. I don't know what they'll run this year, because I do remember that their new head coach had stops where they were much more 4 down. So probably just more true 4 down stuff rather than the hybrid 5-man surface that they were running, especially against bigger personnel. And this is probably the most notable stat for their defense. I mentioned that they were a really good team on 3rd down on offense last year at 45.6%. They were quite literally the exact opposite on the defensive side of the ball. They gave up 3rd downs at the exact same rate of 45.6%, which is awful. That was bottom, I believe, 20. It was either bottom 20 or bottom 15 in FCS. They could not get themselves off of the field, and that's why, if you look back at the box scores, a lot of the scoring that they gave up was scoring late, just because their defense was so gassed by the end of the game that they really just couldn't hang, especially if you were beating them up in the trenches and had a really good running game. That's why North Dakota State and South Dakota State mollywopped them, because they were just dominating them in the trenches, and by the 4th quarter, everyone on defense was gassed. So that's just going to be another thing that K-State could possibly exploit on that side of the ball. But this one's probably going to be even shorter than the offensive side, just because of the inevitable changes. But they did lose their leading tackler in Wyatt Padigo and their leading sack getter in Josh Navaratil, which they have some very, very good names on last year's team. But they did return their second leading tackler in, I believe it's Malachi McNeil. Yeah, it's Malachi McNeil. So they don't really have any notable star defensive players. If this was last year's team, it would almost certainly be Josh Navaratil. But the defense is very zone based, and I think that's just kind of by necessity, where you have the FCS guys who aren't necessarily the greatest athletes, so you're going to have to play a lot more in the way of zone coverage, or you're going to risk getting absolutely dusted on every single route. And it also doesn't help that they were playing that 5-man surface, so if you were playing man coverage, one of those linebackers that's walked up at the edge spot is almost always going to be at a coverage disadvantage for anyone who's running out into the flats, not to pick at fresh scars there for what just happened to K-State. But the defense isn't particularly notable, and they have a lot of trouble with staying on the field. They don't necessarily have the athletes to play true man coverage or to defend very well down the field. We'll see how the new defensive scheming, if there is any, changes things up. But the defense is the weaker of the two, though neither side is all that great. So in terms of what North Dakota is, again, apologies for this being shorter than usual, but analytics really aren't there. Game film is harder to get a hold of, or not necessarily harder to get a hold of. It's harder to get the full picture in a full game, especially when you look up on YouTube North Dakota football, and 9 times out of 10 it's getting eaten by North Dakota State film. But this is a below average FCS team that finished 5-7 last year. They don't really move me, and I know that I have dug myself a hole with this before and calling teams, worse than K-State and then immediately getting bounced. But it's an FCS school, a below average one, so this really should serve as an opportunity for K-State to sort of get themselves right mentally after a heartbreaker in Arlington, or not Arlington, in Ireland. I keep doing that. But this leads us kind of into the stories to watch going into the game, and I already spoke about it, and it's, does K-State bounce back from a massive disappointment in Ireland? And, I mean, it's it would be difficult for them not to, because I do think that a lot of the problems, especially early on in Ireland, could be attributed to the weather. I don't think it's supposed to rain this weekend in Manhattan. So giving them an opportunity to get a true home game, not just one that counts as a home game on your schedule, get in front of the fans, get back to where you're comfortable, really does give everyone an opportunity to sort of get right in terms of their mental after what could be a heartbreaker. It was a heartbreaker for K-State. So that's the first story, is can they treat this as a true get-right game? And sort of tangentially related to that is what adjustments are made from that first week, or what changes are made? Because we are breaking in a new defensive scheme. The depth chart noted, actually, they finally changed the positional terminology. They're the hybrid defender, so it was more of a 3-3 hybrid, or a 4-4-2 hybrid. The true edge rusher is now known as the buck defender, which I'm sure if I looked into it, I could learn more about who they basically took their defensive scheming from, if I just looking at that position in particular. But yeah, it's still breaking in a new defensive scheme. This is a really good team to sort of do that against, not just because, it's an FCS program, but because they're going to throw a lot of different offensive looks at you. So you do get a lot of opportunity to sort of test yourselves. Like, okay, they're coming out in this true 4-wide set, trips to one side of the field. How are we going to adjust either our rush strategy? How are we going to load our coverage one way or the other? And then the very next play, they're going to come out in this really tight jumbo formation with 3 tight ends, where they're pretty much always going to run the ball. So that gives you the opportunity. It's like, okay, how are we going to adjust to this formation? So in a lot of ways, this is a good matchup on the defensive side of the ball, not just talent-wise, but because it gives K-State an opportunity to learn about themselves, learn their limitations, learn more how to play in the specific type of defensive structure, which, while it has its similarities to a 3-3-5, because it's that more hybrid, where you do have a true edge, but you still have those 3 interior guys, you're still going to have to learn how to play in a completely different way than you would have had to before. And even on the offensive side of the ball, this gives more of an opportunity to sort of experiment, see what play calls are or aren't working, even up against lower levels of competition, see what throws Avery is comfortable making. So I keep describing this game, and it keeps sounding more and more like it's a scrimmage. It's not. Counts against both teams' record. But when you are going up against an FCS team, I think that is honestly one of the best times to experiment, at least to an extent. You don't want to go out and suddenly decide that you're a spread option team. Like, you don't want to go out there and run wing bone or triple option up against an FCS team. You still want to be who you are, but a lot of this game should be sort of more definitively finding your identity on both sides of the ball. The next one, to me at least, is how do the defensive backs sort of grow again? Because they had a really good game in the previous week, outside of one person who I mentioned on the recap episode. So I'm just curious to see how they keep growing, because I was really impressed with both Zashawn Rich and Donovan McIntosh. That's it for that particular storyline. So now we get into offensive and defensive MVPs. To me, the offensive MVP is pretty obvious. It has to be Avery Johnson, because although he did accumulate stats and his stat line looked very good in the previous game up against Iowa State, against a really good defense, I think if you asked him, he would say that game wasn't up to his standards. And I'm just curious to see, I want him to take that extra second to throw the ball downfield, as opposed to taking your check down or immediately thinking, oh, here's a rub route, we're going to throw to the route short of the sticks, because that was a little bit infuriating. I will not lie to you. But this is another opportunity for Avery to get used to the Matt Wells offense, for Matt Wells to sort of tinker and see, okay, here's what Avery likes, here's what Avery doesn't like. And, they had an entire summer to do that, but game action and summer scrimmages and practices are two very different things. Because once the bullets are flying, you're going to have different comfort levels with each play call that you're not going to have whenever you are in a practice setting. So to me, the offensive MVP pretty much has to be Avery Johnson. The defensive MVP, again, it's going to be another pretty boring answer, and that's going to be Austin Romaine, because this is going to be a team that is going to prefer to run the football, and who's going to be better at stopping the run than someone who's almost certainly going to be an all Big 12 linebacker, really, really good tackler, really, really athletic, more athletic than any of their running backs. So to me, I hate to be boring, but it's the two most obvious answers that are the most correct 9 times out of 10. So my MVPs are going to be Avery Johnson and Austin Romaine. As for score projections, I don't believe in North Dakota. I don't think that K-State is on any sort of upset alert. I think it's more likely that K-State shuts out North Dakota than loses to them. I'm not going to project a shutout. I do think that North Dakota will get, just because of how K-State is adjusting to the new scheme, I do think that they'll end up getting a big play and then end up getting a field goal out of it. So I'm actually going to go with, we'll say 42-3 in favor of K-State in a game that never feels close, never feels uncomfortable, gets guys back in the right mind state after a really, really tough game in Ireland. And it's not a game that's going to win back a vast majority of the fan base, or the fan base that is still frustrated. And believe me, I understand the frustration. I really do. But it's still a game on the schedule. It's an opportunity to get back into the win column and just take it from the rest of the season. So this is a record time for a preview, but again, FCS team, analytics, yada yada. But thank you all for listening to this episode of the Aggieville Alleycats podcast. If you want to follow or contact the show, you can follow us just about anywhere at Aggieville Alleycats. And if you want to email us, we're aggievillealleycats@gmail.com. If you want to follow me on a more personal note, I am at ACEdwards00. And if you want to follow my co-host Connor, he is at Connor Balthazar. And if you want to support the show financially, please be sure to check out the official Aggieville Alleycats merch store, link found in our podcast and Twitter bio. But most importantly, thank you all for listening to this episode of the Aggieville Alleycats podcast, where come rain, shine, or anything in between, we're here to deliver to you the Kansas State sporting news that you so love. Stay safe, Alleycats.